Hello world. Um, Welcome to the first edition of a live video podcast on catalyzing radical systemic change. So last week we did the 0 edition. So in case you have not listened to it or watched it, it was basically why the whole shebang on the why, how, what, and who of the endeavor ahead to discover, map, and cross-pollinate what I think are the crucial building blocks towards manifesting planetary civilization ahead. And I just want to briefly touch upon the interesting historical coincidence. So today in 1938 was the night of broken glass, and also the Berlin Wall fell. And it truly was not on my mind when I was planning for these Tuesdays. It literally just came up planning with my guests, like what slots were available. And I truly think, obviously, I'm not occupying that space for Alistair Langer, that we are in a crucial moment of us as a sentient species, as humanity, because we know as humanity that by far the most challenges we face can't be solved on a nation state level. And the interesting feature is we don't know exactly how that transition will look like, but there is no other possibility for us, including all other sentient and non-sentient entities on this beautiful planet, to survive by the end of the century. So with that short introductory blurb, it's really my honor and thanks, Indy Johar, for opening up that field of discovery together. And I did not feel like sketching Indy and reading out loud. So maybe as a very first question, Indy, why the name Dark Matter Labs? And maybe a sketch of your biography. What brought you here into that moment in space-time?
Good evening. Good evening from Edinburgh. I'm honored and delighted to be here, Alistair. And what an auspicious or strange night that we've come together at. I suppose I think, you know, for me, the reason why dark matter became interesting was it became clearer and clearer to me in the work that I was doing. I trained as an architect, helped build stuff like OpenDesk, helped build stuff like WikiHouse, helped build part of the building the Impact Hub network. That it became very evident to me that behind everything we were building, there were fundamental questions that were not being talked about or addressed. And those fundamental questions were so deeply ingrained, they were kind of social imaginaries that had become almost de facto coded. They were unquestionable, property right, all the way through to current employment contracts, how we perceive them, all the way through to our money formation mechanisms. All of these things have been, for a while, so deeply coded that they're almost unchallengeable. Yet they construct everything around us. Our theory of control has been an underlying theory of control, which is manifesting through everything we see around us. And I would say a theory of control has been a kind of function of the birth of kings and queens for the last 6,000 years, maybe 10,000 years. Our theory of seeing the world through objects is an extension of that theory of control. There's something that actually is a social imaginary that allows us to distangle deeper, or at least create the illusion of untangling ourselves from the world, to be able to isolate things independent from us, to create object-subject relationships which allow for the manifestation of violence and transportation. So the object-subject relationship is really critical in setting up a new theory of violence, all the way through to actually, I would say, I think the most profound revolution, and people like Thomas Bjorkman talk about this as well, and Daniel Schittenberger, that actually we're in a stage of I would argue, a new emergence of a planetary consciousness. So I think what is unique is that for the first time, I think we're seeing a human machine ecological consciousness, a consciousness that can be reactive, that's a combination of satellite information, our sensing capabilities at satellite level, to our institutional capabilities, to our ecological flows, and to create new forms of a kind of planetary consciousness that I don't think has ever happened, as far as we know, in the history of the planet. And we've had many civilizations, but never a planetary consciousness that is able to do with planetary level transformation. So these deep social imaginaries, and all the way through our imagination of self, which I shouldn't forget, our imagination of self has been constructed. The idea of individuality, and individualhood has been constructed through the object theory, our recognition of that objectness of humanity, the Platonic idea, the Tuvian man, and Leonardo da Vinci constructed an idea of person, and then in the idea of classification, we constructed theories of race, and that was a mechanism to commit human to human violence models. So we have been using all these social imaginaries to effectively construct the world around us. But those social imaginaries are just that, they're social imaginaries. And they are open to be challenged and reinvented. In fact, I think we now live in an age, because of a planetary civilization, because actually an age of complexity, which means that we cannot organize the world through control, but we have to organize it through learning and the decentralized learning capacity, because we have to recognize entangled values. These three things are effectively creating a whole new world perspective. And I think that requires us to reinvent and recode our social imaginaries for a new age. And I think we've historically, periodically done this. We've reimagined ourselves and reimagined the world around us, and thereby recoded our social imaginaries, our dark matters, and thereby reconstructed the world around us. And I want to put a point here that I would say right now, in terms of just climate change, most of the world around us, literally most of the world around us, whether it's our food systems, whether it's the fact of clothes that we wear, whether it's most of the material systems we consume, they're not real. They won't transmit. They won't go through what is the core required transition required. So I think not only is our materiality now, I think, at the end of its life, I think we're at the age of a new social imagery, dark matter, and that is going to require us and allow us to construct a whole new way of living in the world. And I think that, to me, is why the dark matter project became to me very critical. Having built things in the world, it was actually at the recode level that we needed to transform our relationship with the world.
So my gut feeling was, preparing for that dialogue with you, that it makes sense for the audience, before we dive into the hands-on projects, prototype, the work that like Dark Matter Labs is actually deploying, because it's like very hands-on stuff, that we look at some of the concepts. So you have basically sketched in a beautiful blurb that we need to move from a subject-object relationship to the fact that actually, if not everything, then things are entangled, not only in nature, but also in society. And this fundamentally asks to construct the economy differently, but also, and we will touch upon that later in the like, let's say, projects section, like the theory of value, wealth creation, but also like how in whole industries and sectors are working. So point being, entanglement seems to be an important building block. The second building block that I would like to touch on, and briefly just mentioning that, is long-termism. So we have all heard from these indigenous cultures, without getting retro-romantic, because some of the pre-modern cultures were also not able to sustain themselves. The most famous example being the Easter Islands. So I'm not an advocate for the indigenous did it all right. That's not the point, but like long-termism. So that actually we're creating a whole bunch of externalities. So from a systemic perspective, we really need to think about how to incorporate long-termism. So again, before we dive into like the deeper aspects of it, why do you think that long-termism is such a crucial building block?
So I think long-termism is such an interesting question. So the first thing I think we have to sort of talk about long-termism is, right, there's so many different layers to this. First thing, who has the privilege of thinking long-term? So, and what are the implications? So we have created a society which is fundamentally precarious. Our economic theory from the industrial age is about construction of precarity, because precarity allows for the instrumentalization of people to the labor markets. Who does the bullshit job? In order to do the bullshit job, you have to create precarity. That precarity allows for the instrumentalization of people. And that is all being constructed on the idea of Homo economos. So Homo economos is a rational, self-optimizing, greedy individual. And as long as we keep giving external incentives, that Homo economos will optimize. And if you create precarity, you can hyper-optimize. So this is really about seeing individuals as partly programmed machines, bad machines as I call them, in a kind of system, in a mechanical system. Now, when we talk about long-termism, we already know that precarity, if you make people psychologically vulnerable, their thinking modality changes. So in economic recessions, for example, people tend to buy more chocolate, people tend to buy more fast fashion, they'll buy more hairdressing effects, because what they will buy is psychological fixes to their precarity. Whereas those that are rich will actually, in recession, make long-term decisions. So the first question is the democracy of long-term. Who is long-term? Who has the capacity to think about long-term? And I think those fundamentally make different decisions if you have the security to be able to think long-term. So that's one thing. And I think we have a society where long-termism is a privilege of the few, and actually the many are in precarity. The second dimension of long-termism, and I think this is also critical, is that long-termism as long-termism of civilization. This has been very accurately criticized recently. Whereas if we think that civilization has to survive and existential risks, then you very quickly think, is long-termism the idea that some people must survive? Is it a framework again of the privilege? Because if some people survive, civilization survives. And that to me is also a very dangerous theory, because it opens up an idea that many must sacrifice ourselves. This is not a democracy of long-termism. It's again, it's a long-termism as a mechanism of the few privilege to the theory that civilization will manifest itself and we all sacrifice ourselves for civilization. And again, I think that is also a problematic view of long-termism. Then the third dimension of long-termism, which I think is definitely there, is a theory that actually, as societies, democracies, we have fundamentally broken our capacity to think long-term. So societal decision-making frameworks are fundamentally broken. And our capacity, our institutional capacity, our institutional incentives mean that Western democracies cannot perceive outside the 2-year cycle, not the 4-year cycle, the 2-year cycle. And the same is true for, we've created firefly type organizations which are actually struggle to be able to allocate capital over a 50-year horizon or a longitudinal horizon. So as a society, we no longer can actually make strategic 50-year decisions and allocations. And we've lost the democratic capability. We don't have the institutional mechanisms to make infrastructure scale decisions. And that, I think, is another dimension. So when we talk about long-termism, I think we have to talk about the democracy of long-termism, the societal capabilities of long-termism, and then also, I would argue, long-termism for the all, right? Not long-termism for the few. So I think there is a very interesting case to be made for long-termism, but in a very considered manner. And I think it's fundamental that actually having short-term decision making means that you can create externalities into the future. It's very clear that fundamentally our current economic engines are massively at the act of destroying future generations. So our short-termism has moved future generations off the table of stakeholders, and we are terminating futures. So there's a fundamental question here about how we construct our theory of long-termism. Is not just a theory of how we persist into the future, but it's having relationship to the future and recognizing our relationship with the future and recognizing us over that period. So I think long-termism is a very interesting frame, and it opens up some really strategic conversations about how we manifest it, how do we create societal capabilities to actually democratize long-termism, to ensure long-termism is an inclusive idea, and fundamentally, how do we create institutional capacity for long-termism? And I think that requires deep structural reform. I think long-termism as an idea of actually sustaining and persisting futures requires structural reform to deal with.
Okay, I would like to jump in here and build on that. So first category, entanglement. Second category, deep time or long-termism. And you were touching upon 2 points that I think are like very interesting to shed a light upon. One of which is like artificial precarity. I'm not saying there was no precarity during certain times, but we're certainly already living in an age where precarity is artificially constructed to benefit a class of like a very few people, especially when we look at like energy and stuff like that. And the second one that you were also touching upon in your blurb was speciesism. So what I think is important, that once we think from a abundance perspective, and us as the dominant species on this planet in the Anthropocene, to move towards the shepherds, not only for the future of, let's say, human animals, but also other sentient beings, this opens up, like I would say, even a deeper layer of the conversation. And then maybe after another concept, I would like, showcase some examples for the audience.
I mean, yes, I think these layers work together, right? These concepts of entanglement, this concept of time, for me, they are fundamental conversations about how we see ourselves and how we relate to the world. So I think one of the biggest challenges that we've got is we see ourselves as distinct from the world. I mean, I would argue, the astronaut in space is a perfect example of the distancing of ourselves from the world. So in the appreciation of entanglement in space and time constructs fundamentally a different theory of manifesting ourselves. And it requires us to then, and when you think about the entanglement, let's just keep going with that. I'm going to go backwards and then come forward. Is that, what do I actually mean by the entanglement? So if you take a house, what is the value of a house? The value of a house is its resale value, its rental value, its education outcomes, health outcomes, social care outcomes, energy generation, its water purification, its ecological services, all the way through to its maintenance value and the redistribution of its maintenance value, all the way through to actually when you put multiple houses together, you get a social scale effect of a local economic velocity and multiplier, which is much larger than an individual. So the house is an entangled problem. Yet we assume it to be distant. And we know this, right? So access to labor markets, there's huge value in the house. So we know that we do, obviously the work with the Highline, or you map the Highline, you realize that you could have paid for the Highline in under 10 months if you put together 10% of the land value of it. So,
wait, Indy, and I need to jump in there for our listeners or people that are watching. When you were sketching the Highline, you were actually talking not only about the entanglement of assets, but also about spillover value. So the Highline, could you quickly just give a
sure
2 minutes run through of the Highline project, because this is actually a very interesting hands-on example, right?
Yeah, so the Highline New York, a beautiful project, a beautiful sort of conversion of a railway into a park. Actually, we did run the math and the numbers behind it, and what you realize is that the Highline itself, which cost 173 million, I think, to build, and it struggles, by the way, but it's amazing. It would have paid for itself, 173 million, if you just took 10%, 1/10 of the land value benefit it generated for all the land around. If you just took 10% of it, it would have paid for itself in 10 months.
Yeah,
which is extraordinary. Which shows the quantum of value that civic in every object creates in the spillover effect. So when we talk about the entanglement is about reimagining our relationship of value in different formats and relationships of utility. Currently, all that value is privatized, right? All that value, the cost is socialized, and the wealth is privatized. And this is a really, frankly, I think that's what we've done over the last 100 years. In a kind of where we thought the world was relatively infinite, I would say we've gone from an infinite world to a small world view. In an infinite world view, the values spill over all the social liabilities. All the liabilities were socialized, and everyone thought they wouldn't be priced, and all the wealth was privatized. Now, as the world has become smaller, those entanglements or spillover values are now manifest, measurable, and also in many cases self-defeating. So climate change, I think, is a small world scenario where our externalities are now terminating us. So as the world has shrunk, these interdependencies driven off the cliff.
Maybe as a good transition, just one question that we might then cut out. We have quite some background noise, Indy. I suppose it's just a lot of people sitting around you and having a lot of discussions where you're sitting.
I won't be able to move significantly just because we're in park, but hopefully that's a bit better. Let me just do something. If I can do something.
Just because then
noise cancellation. I have voice isolation on, but I don't think it's doing that.
Okay. It's the way it is. I have the feeling to show the people like a hands-on example of what we're going to do is I want to show the spillover effects, and I want to showcase them. Maybe you start explaining the idea behind trees as infrastructure, and then we show the people like a hands-on example of how that looks already today. Maybe you sketch also the way, like how long it took, where the project is standing, and where we think very possibly actually this project could lead to, because it's a good example of a non-human actor that has multiple entangled relationships with other human and non-human actors, and where the spillover effects created by urban forests could actually create to a whole new asset class that where literally also the different stakeholders, meaning not only the private investors, but also the cities, as well as the citizens, could get the benefits from this new asset class. Because I just think this is like a really brilliant and simple example.
Absolutely. And it comes from a very baseline reality that most cities chop down their trees after 10 years. And they chop them down because effectively the only thing that is valued about urban trees is their insurance costs and their maintenance costs, which means that most urban trees are liabilities, and they end up being chopped down after 10 years because these liabilities become significant after 10 years. So what we've got is a model of how we now we also recognize that urban trees produce huge amounts of gifts, which are as yet the value of these gifts is largely seen as gifts. They aren't priced, they aren't valued in structural senses. So it becomes very clear that when we start to operationalize this stuff in new ways, we have to start to think about these things in smart ways. So these are some of the things that we've been looking at, is looking at these spillover effects unit by unit into these stories. And now what's really clear is that the multi-beneficiary effects of things, and this is, I think, really goes back to this entangled worldview. Firstly, these things are dynamic. Whilst we put some figures here, these are always contextual. They're not fixed. They're not universal market frameworks. They're actually contextual price, which means that classic market theory doesn't work on this valuation. So they will be always contextual. They're highly contingent, and they're and they have multiple benefits. So the question then becomes, how are you optimizing these benefits? And what's the optimization, and what's the continuous optimization of urban forests in that framework? So there's a very interesting point of view that our theories of ownership were fantastic when you were doing single point optimization.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you're optimizing things to a single point of view, ownership works really well. When you're talking about doing multi-point optimization, actually ownership becomes quite problematic from a single point perspective, because what you have is multi-optimizing systems both in space and time, and they need to optimize dynamically and re-optimize. So if they're optimized towards one particular outcome, you will create monoculture species of, say, carbon sequestration with huge amounts of liabilities onto other points of the system. So how we think about optimization becomes fundamentally different if we start to see these assets in fundamentally different terms. And these assets are also, yeah.
Let's jump into that and stay there for a couple of minutes, because when we look at the chart, and for those only listening, I will share the possibility to look at the slides for the audio only version. Is we see here in the chart precisely entanglement. We in a way have a third dimension, which is the long-term perspective, because we all know that a tree well kept usually outlives a human life. And we also see both the challenges, but also the amazing opportunities that we need to move towards new governance structures and new ways to understand property, ownership, and value. And I would like to have you, talk a little bit where a project like this is precisely standing, also where it is coming from, the challenges, but also the ways in which this could or hopefully will develop.
So we're working with multiple cities, and we're working with Glasgow City, for example, to look at how do you think about this project at landscape level. So not at project level, but at the whole city level, and that becomes important because of effectively there are certain benefits, so canopy cover, that's effectively a function of a whole city landscape view. So what we're doing is working with cities to think about landscape level measuring of nature-based outcomes, landscape level maintenance, and landscape level models. And I think maintenance is about pledging how citizens and other people start to care about these things. We know in the first 10 years, actually you have to provide a significant amount of care, and then less so. We also know that actually, unless you have that care, the additionality, i.e. the environmental services that they provide, carbon sequestration and other things, can't be guaranteed, can't be actual additionality. So you have to be able to actually verify that care. We have to be able to model some of these outcomes because they're multi-beneficiary outcomes. So how we model these outcomes and how to be able to communicate that value and verify that value to multiple parties. So what we're trying to create is a new type of infrastructure, which is both financed over by longitudinal financing, maybe a perpetual bond in Horizon 1, but maybe others. So how do you finance this infrastructure with multiple benefits, with continuous optimization and stewardship models and pledging models, which allow for that additionality to be measured, to be contained, and to be actually modeled in really smart ways. And that also leaves a very powerful citizen component into this, because actually when we're making this economy, we are not trying to monetize it at the point of projects. We're trying to monetize it at the point of outcomes. which means that you can gift new projects to a city in return for the rights of the future outcomes. And that allows us to create a value model at the city scale, whilst not trying to instrumentalize every transaction or financialize a tree. And that opens up those trees and those urban forests to be part of the civic domain, part of actually civic care, and part of actually the gift economy of life itself. So I think we are trying quite hard to build whole landscape level investment models which actually don't monetize, that create space for genuine human care economy, yet do macro smart monetization at the service level, integrated level, at the whole city level, which mitigates long-term liabilities, whether it's peak energy demand, health outcomes, other formats, as we've said.
That's I try to just repackage that a bit, because I really find it exciting as one example, and we will dive into other examples, because in just a few years, maybe a few decades of time, the vast majority of human beings will live in like mega cities. So what I want to pinpoint to is, this might seem as a very avant-garde futurist scenario, and this is where I want to bring in like Horizon 1, 2, and 3 thinking. But I think in both our understanding, obviously this work is done to then be rolled out for like really big agglomerations. So we're not talking obviously just about like mid-sized cities, but that like huge agglomerations like Los Angeles would be a good example. I mean, they could really, have a decent and multiple spillover effects, from planting urban forests to even bigger agglomerations in like Asia. So what I would like to listen into, I mean, we can't look into the crystal ball, but where do you see a project like that standing from concept, prototyping, scaling, to being actually a new asset class that really plants trees in the hundreds of millions, let's say?
Yeah, I think so. There's, in Horizon 1 terms, I think what this allows us to do is radically increase urban forests and canopy cover of our existing cities, and with massive societal benefit. So it allows us to be able to value. It creates a whole new typology of an asset class, which is, I think, fundamentally different. It allows us to be able to finance these sort of many-to-many asset classes. It allows us to build the capabilities of being able to build that. So I think that's Horizon 1. But Horizon 2 is really being able to think of value through this entangled sense. And as societies start to value things where and organize things in fundamentally different ways. You already know that we're doing a piece of work called the free house, where houses become self-sovereign. I think that when you intermingle that with trees and infrastructure, you start to create a new theory of a city, which all the objects are self-sovereign, where our relationships are not that of ownership, but stewardship and care. So I think that starts to build a really powerful second horizon worldview. And then a third horizon worldview, when that all starts to intermingle, is actually, I think, quite a different type of human machine economy, a machined monetary economy, and maybe a very powerful gift economy of humans, which works fundamentally different. And I think that's where we're headed, is incentive-based machine economies operating at one scale. So if you look at the work, why we're doing whole city retrofit, is we're trying to create an economic model which operates at this whole city level, but effectively gifts the transactions of energy reduction to the citizens largely. So what we're creating is not new debt and new instrumentalization of citizens, but new macro models which are not based on actually instrumentalizing individuals, but creating these kind of system scale business models, which historically weren't possible. All these system scale business models, which are optimizing on the basis of social incentives and other things, were not possible till recently. Only now can we create the computational capabilities the incentive structures, the measuring structures, the pledge infrastructures, to be able to construct these new economic models. So I would say the third horizon is almost a new economic monetary model at a large scale, but actually the human scale being very much of gift and care. And I think that's a fundamentally different human economy. People like David Graeber, who I think is extraordinary, starts to talk, starts to lean this way. But I think these two economies would coexist. And I don't want to give you a vision of the city, but I can certainly say the horizon goes from trees and sort of fully self-sovereign objects to, I think, fundamentally a new type of economic relationship.
Before we dive into another topic, I want to share again the screen and move from forests to other nature-based assets. And I'm really curious on how can we nuance what we, putting me and DML into like one box, how can we nuance this from what the Intrinsics Exchange Group is planning? Because what we're trying to build is obviously not more extractive business models, but entangle the various assets and having a multi-to-multi relationship that the co-benefits and the spillover effects actually flow back to the people like as civic assets, so to say, instead of like privatizing the wealth and like basically externalizing all the problems.
Again, I don't want to disparage what other people are doing. I think there's loads of work to be done. But I suppose what's different is that if you have an asset perspective, you're optimizing the asset for return. Right? You're optimizing the asset for return to investors. If you have a systems perspective, what you're trying to do in a co-beneficiary perspective, you're looking at maximizing the co-beneficiary impacts with a return. So this is really taking a fundamentally different view. And also, I think we have to recognize that, and what I think is the real revolution is our theory of assets is based on assets as cars. Predictable linear systems with warranties that will give year-on-year effects. Whereas actually, I think what we're talking about with nature is a fragile, massively interdependent, contingent asset, which is highly fragile. And it requires not maintenance to preserve the asset value, but actually genuine stewardship to create a generative asset. This will create generative value over time because it has a multiplier. It's life. It's not a car. Car doesn't create a car yet. So I think what we've got is fundamentally a different typology of asset classes, which actually have huge. We are now not only be able to imagine them, which we could, I think, previously, but actually we can computationally construct them, and we can construct that value. We create the democratic frameworks to understand that distribution of value, and we can actually compute that value in really smart ways. So for me, this is a real revolution in our field of how we perceive assets. And I think fundamentally a lot of that work is about reimagining how we perceive and construct assets.
I'm now consciously jumping from the tangible part, so you can touch a tree and lean on a tree and it provides shade, to what Dark Matter Labs coins intangible infrastructure. Before I again would like to have you like dive deeper into one of these beautiful charts, why do you think it is so important that a modern welfare state already now, but even more so in the next decades to come, needs to invest into intangible infrastructure and unpack that as a concept and really invest into the, let's say, personal development of its citizens? Why do you think that's so important?
Well, fundamentally, I think we're moving. So I think we're at an economic level. We are in a 21st century angled pause. We're in a 40-year pause between machines are in the process of building capabilities, which procedural work becomes less and less valuable. And we're seeing this already. Middle class wages are falling. So management and procedural work, i.e., we are living in an age of post-managerialism, and that is already manifesting in our economy and society around us. We are moving in an age where actually the value of human contribution is, I think, about creativity, craft, which is the iteration of innovation in context, uh, complex cognition, and care. Right? I would say these four things, and these are capabilities that require actually fundamentally, as the 19th century required us to be physically fit, to be able to go to work 9 to 5, these require us to be emotionally and cognitively thriving in order to be able to do this work. So as we move into this new economy from procedural work to the four C's, we have to create a new human development base. And this is nothing new. Every industrial revolution, we've done this. We've created schools, and schools were there to teach us about being predictable. They are predictable engines, right? They're there to incentivize you to wake up and be there by 9 and finish by 3:15, do your classes on time. They're about making you predictable. Right? In fact, they were training to make you predictable. That predictability was critical for an economy of machines. Now we're moving into a new economy where actually procedural work is being removed. And that means that we have to invest in a new human development thesis. That means we have to invest in actually building the democratization of long-term thinking, the democratization of creativity, the democratization of actually manifesting our well-being in really smart ways. And that is a structural transformation. We have to actually stop people being precarious, because precarity reduces their complex cognition capabilities. So we have to construct a new welfare state fit for the 21st century, which is about unlocking these capabilities, and which is why loads of people are talking about universal basic income. The universal basic income for me is not just about poverty. It is about systemically changing the economic model. It is about changing an economic model, which means we construct actually a base of human development that allows for the full flourishing of everyone in a smart way. And this is, again, some of the work that you're showing is actually recognizing the entanglement or the multiple contextual features that drive mental health in really, really smart, critical ways. And these aren't just functions of biological. 60% of all issues are constructed through context. So, all sorts of issues, from financial poverty takes out 13 IQ points, all the way through to our food system, to air pollution. All these things are undermining our cognitive capabilities. So if we're going to build a new society, we're going to have to almost do what we did in the 19th century, is build the context for a new society. And that includes the physical context for a new mental health, but also building the kind of intangible infrastructures for that. And that is the asset of the 21st century. The asset of the 21st century is not the bridges, it's a cognitive collective intelligence of a city. That is a foundational asset. It's an asset. We can measure it, we can understand its value, and we can significantly invest in driving it.
And before we dive into the last part of the conversation, from, so to say, how can we bake long-termism and entanglement into, I would say, new business models and generally into a new theory of value, with the example of trees as infrastructure, and now mental health as a core capability of us as citizens, I would even dare to say that for the politicians, for those that we think as citizens, they're taking care of us, and we, in a way, as citizens, often almost, lean back and have this, oh, this is too complicated for me, please, you politicians, do that. If we rethink our democratic institutions and the processes and how our democratic institutions are working, I have the feeling that the investment of a modern welfare state, not only in the cognitive complexity, but also in the emotional complexity, which has a lot to do with like trauma healing and stuff like that, needs to invest. Because how can we become like shepherds and even think imagine and feel beyond the narrow confinements of, let's say, the Germans or the Brits. I mean, Brexit was showing that clearly, where clearly the challenges, not all, but many, I would say most of them, have planetary scale. So I really think we're in some very, very crucial decades ahead. I mean, we can't park these big questions for a century and then revisit them, right?
No, I mean, for me, there's a fundamental question of how we perceive ourselves. If you perceive yourselves as a boundary object, then you will always create boundaries of everything else. So language like community, who's in and who's out. Community is basically a boundary model. You know, even with systems thinking, I often come into rooms and say, what's the boundary of the system? And I feel like an idiot. There's no boundary of a system. There's a horizon of a system, but it's not boundary, because fundamentally, that's the point of a relational logic, is it's boundaryless. There are horizons, definitely. Your horizon is different from my horizon, right? Because the horizons are always different. So I think when we start to take this worldview, I think it opens us up to a fundamentally different way of manifesting, imagining ourselves, also then imagining our relationship. If I cannot know, if a tree cannot be reduced to the value of timber, and I cannot understand the full value, because actually it's multiple, then my relationship with the tree is that of treaty, which is not of extraction, but actually being in a relationship of care with that. And that's fundamentally a different type of theory than a relationship of extraction and single point optimism. So I think as we start to talk about this revolution, it's a revolution of self. It's a revolution of our relationship with the world, both in space and time. And then it's a revolution of organizing, which isn't based on control, but is actually fundamentally based on learning. So these structural revolutions, I think, are. And then the final thing is we have to recognize everything as a citizen. And in the theory of recognizing everything as a citizen, you recognize its entanglement and the need for a relationship of care, and thereby the kind of theory of learning. So I think we're in a structural transformation of all these dimensions, which together will drive some of this stuff.
So that you just mentioning learning, just want to sketch it my way, so everybody listens. This is Alistair framing, not Indy. I have the feeling our way representative parliamentary democracy is working is certainly not the last evolution of the way we govern ourselves. I always, as the polemic guy, coin it a little bit pre-DOS, pre-monochrome, right? Pre-mouse, no iOS, right? Like it's many of these processes were thought through in the many centuries ago, but certainly, just to pick the example in Germany, the constitution is more or less done like it was done in 1948. So towards the last part of our dialogue, I'm really curious, and I hope, because I did screenshot some of the unpublished stuff, where do you see learning capabilities within institutions, within organizations, and what could be experimental sandboxes to really try out new ways to then reform the processes these institutions work?
So let me go at this question in a very direct way. I'm not arguing about learning capabilities. I'm arguing a transition from being control-orientated, i.e., how do you work in a complex emergent world, is you get more and more control. CEO tries to define more and more, right, a complex emergent world. And that is a fundamental problem. CEO does not have the information, never will have the information to be able to define greater, higher, and higher resolution to what is a complex emergent world. So in that context, our theory of dealing with unknown externalities cannot be delivered by control. it can only be delivered by every node acting with a theory of care.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that acting of theory of care has to be an act of civic responsibility from every point of view, enabled by a learning framework to allow recognizing that everything is learning to understand its consciousness, interdependence with the world, and recognizing that you have to build feedback, curriculum frameworks, all the way through to, and I use curriculum in its broader sense. Data curriculum, feeding in data is also a theory of curriculum. What is a knowledge base to which you're constructing from, as well as all the way through to the integrity of actions. So when you look at this, fundamentally changes our theory of control to learning oriented and empowers innovation and leadership at the front end of every engagement. That front end could be a human, that front end could be a house, could be anything, it doesn't matter. So I think this is a structural transformation of how do we deal with complexity? And we cannot deal with complexity through control because it's informationally impossible. And that means we have to build learning, so the learning agency and the craft agency of those on the front line, and the learning capacity of those actors, and the learning frameworks for those mechanisms to learn and adopt and evolve. So for me, this is a structural transformation. Now then, when you take this and you say, all right, and we recently did this with Caroline, sort of a quick post with it. So what is a learning parliament? Right? And to be respectful, I think this is amazing work being done by
Caroline Paulik
by Caroline. Exactly, because I think when you start to put this together, and what becomes really clear is, well, what is a learning parliament? And a parliament which isn't focused on trying to make decisions, but is focused on trying to learn. What is a political party which isn't telling you we will do this in the next 5 years when it knows it can't, because every situation is complex and emergent? Actually, what you're looking for is the integrity of that system to learn. So I think for me, this is about taking things from being object and decision orientated to actually being about noun and learning orientation. And it's about introducing life, and I would say learning is a fundamental factor of life and consciousness, into our institutional frameworks, rather than seeing them as autonomous decision-making systems, actually devoid of it. I think this changes our relationship with politicians, because we don't ask politicians to tell us what they will do in the next 5 years. But what we're really looking for them to do is actually explore how they will act with integrity over what is a complex emergent issue. How will they build the learning capacity of the system? How will they advance the quality of feedback in the system? How will they actually build distributed agency in the system to be able to verify the actions and the verification of that model? So fundamentally, this moves us into a different model. How will politicians reconstruct the theory of context for institutions to make better longitudinal decisions? So politicians start to operate at a meta level, meta leverage level of the systems change, as opposed to trying to give definitive answers to a complex world, which is virtually impossible to give. So this requires reform in who we are and how we relate to the world, are questions for politicians, and a freedom for politicians to reinvent themselves in that process.
Okay, then my question would be, in as much as there hopefully are some philanthropists, next gen high net worth and ultra high net worth people that have a genuine interest in bridging the transition towards long-term wealth management. What could be a political argument for politicians in an ultra short term cycle of needing to be re-elected? Is it do you think like long term will be part of the sustainability agenda? Or
my view, and I'd love to speak to more people about this, but my view is very straightforward. The biggest challenge we face right now is our capacities of societies to make decisions and to organize the change. We do not have an information problem about climate change. We know what the problem is.
Absolutely.
But the fundamental problem is we do not have the mechanisms to organize. And I think in a complex emergent world, that is the revolution that is going to decide whether we have assets still in civilization or whether we're living in a firestorm. So if I was an investor, the key metadata I'd be looking for is what is the quality of this society to make and action decisions. Because that is going to be the number one characteristic of a society in the 21st century. And what's happened is industrial democracies do not have the capacity to make decisions anymore. So I think if I was a significant investor in Europe, my number one push would be actually in investing in this intangible asset of society. The decision-making capacity of a city is a fundamental asset, because on the basis of this, everything else will resolve. And
I would say not only
understand that.
Yeah, not only the decision making, but also to really care about the long term. My gut feeling is as well, if other ways to organize citizens that are not based on democracy, right, outcompete us in being able to make decisions and plan for the long term, then the most important thing to reform our democracies is actually, like you beautifully framed, is supporting the ways that we as citizens organize, reform the institutions so that we are actually able to make decisions and plan for the long term.
I think there's two things here. One, yes, we have to improve our ability as societies to make decisions. And remember, decisions are not consensus models. I'm not interested in large-scale consensus systems. And this is, I think, one of the big fallacies that we fall into. One of the real innovations of the market, and I don't think we have markets, we have largely free feudalism, is actually it builds decentralized decision-making capacity. And that is extraordinary agency. Now, if we can construct markets for good, then we can mobilize people to operate that way. So that's fine. But also what's clear is that the real magic of democracies is not that democracies make the best decisions. The real magic of democracies is they are able to change their mind. And that means we have the best corrective function, right? It is the best corrective function that differentiates democracy from autocracies. Autocracies tend to basically make a decision, typically relatively good ones, and then finally terrible ones, and they stick to it. And it's a sticking to those decisions that's actually deadly. Whereas democracies have the capacity to be able to evolve the decision. So for me, this is about creating new types of decision-making models and agency models, which is going to be fundamental. So if I was a strategic investor, I would be saying, what is the deep democracy of a society to be able to make not only decisions, but actually correct decisions? And that capacity has to be massively pluralistic. So pluralistic capability fundamentally builds capacity to deal with complexity in new formats. So it is not about monolithic decisions of consensus. So consensus-based decisions are actually very fragile, because you and I, even between you and I, certain things that I will never know, right? So if you and I vote, it's a terrible idea, because the reality is you know way more than I do, and it will only be a more stupid decision as a result. And the consensus-based models risk that problem. So there's a really important question about when we use consensus, when we use representative, when we use deliberative, and then when we use decentralized distributed civic accountability as a new theory, and then when we use actually kind of really markets for good in really smart ways. So I think we have to talk about societal decision-making in a much more fundamental way and see it as a whole plethora of capabilities.
Yeah. So I have not planned this podcast series for an exact 1 hour or 1 hour and a half. I have the feeling we're moving towards the end. I would like to zoom out and see DML from an ecosystems perspective. When you are seeing what DML as an organism is trying to birth, what are the other important nutrients that ecosystem needs? What are the different, let's say, actors in the field to be able to truly not only rethink and conceptualize, but really move towards prototyping, experimenting, and rolling out these, let's say, very fundamental discussions, that we're having here?
I mean, one of the things I think we're really fortunate about is having really great partners who recognize that these aren't just side conversations, right? These aren't side conversations. The challenge is not actually, a heat source pump, heat source air pump, right? That is not the problem.
Yeah.
Right? We have that, and I think one of the biggest things I think we need to do across our European landscape is start to recognize the scale of the challenge. And I think the ability to have honest conversations leads us to typologies of answers that I think are being explored by DM, right? Because I think they're the only typologies of answers that are available to deal with what we're talking about. So this is one of those moments where we actually have to think bigger. And my biggest worry is that as a generation, we seem to have forgotten that we as a generation built the global institutions, or our parents did. So 1833, we did extraordinary things to abolish slavery. So I think we've lost our art of our belief in ourselves to do extraordinary things. And this moment requires us to decode, recode our civilization and recognize that's critical. And that requires our ability to be audacious. So our ability to be audacious in radical formats. And I think we're seeing some brilliant partners that we have to work with around this stuff. But these are fundamental questions of how value is organized, how we perceive ourselves, what theories of governance looks like, all the way through to actually new models of organizing more fundamentally, which we're manifesting in all of DM. So we're purposefully trying to code all of this stuff in how we organize our organization, all the way through to the work that we're doing. And yes, we need partners. We need more partners and more partners to join us. But actually, for me, it's the audacity that's really critical. So it's not just about come join us. I think what we need is a real audacity to embrace the scale of what we're facing. Only then, I think, can we build the pathways and the routes that are required.
Thanks. Indy, with that audacious finale, I have nothing to add. I really, maybe as the host of this very first dialogue, for whatever reason, it falls on November 9, with clearly the Berlin Wall falling. And I want to invite those watching and or listening to really allow yourselves to let internal mental and emotional barriers fall, because the only way forward, I totally agree, is like bold and audacious, because the challenges can only be solved on a planetary level. So I want to invite those that have access to institutional leverage, to people that can open doors or that want to cooperate on a strategic level, because clearly, like I stated in the very first version, the 0 version on the why, how, what, the whole shebang, I'm not doing this literally just to inspire people. I want to inspire people to then really contribute something, contribute a contact or open doors, because we all together can only do this. It's not like DML can solve this, like much as we as citizens would like to hand this over to just politicians. Oh, please sort out the mess. I'm like too small. This is like really overwhelming me in the same way, right? It can't be that super think tank, DML just doing that. We really need to approach this from an ecosystemic perspective. Indy, I have nothing more to say but saying thank you and wishing you a beautiful evening. Do you want last words?
I'd like to say one thing. I think
Sure.
we meet together on a night, a very crazy night. I think it's really important to recognize the scale of how big worlds can change on this night. And it's Crystal, whether it's Berlin Wall falling down, these were extraordinary transitions in what were perceived untouchable worlds. And I think we are in moments very similar. I think we're in moments when actually the old worlds are, for good or bad, very vulnerable. And I think we have to start to embrace this is not an audacity of kind of egoism. It's not an audacity of some kind of heroism. It's an audacity that's necessary. It's an audacity that's required to deal with what we're about to face. And the theory of breakthrough, if we want to break through to act, and I genuinely believe this is possible, that we can break through to a new machine-human ecological position where we actually build a planetary civilization. You know, it's quite beautiful to think the planet itself is becoming conscious.
Absolutely.
In the universe, it's a beautiful thing. At the same point, I think the risks of us breaking down are significant. And if we break down, there won't be a pathway back to this position because the tools of violence that we build are so extraordinary and so significant that the likelihood of auto-destructive behavior becoming the species is very high. So I think this is a really precarious moment. And the precarity is not from the ego of whether humans will survive. I think the precarity is whether planetary consciousnesses that we're just giving birth to will actually become a new, genuine planetary consciousness. Maybe one of the first in the universe, who knows? But it's certainly something like this that I think is really beautiful for us to imagine. So it doesn't come from an ego of being human. I think it comes from an ego of recognizing actually the idea of what is being given birth
to. I already kind of signed off and gave you the final word, but what's really interesting, you gave me a ball to iterate again on the Berlin Wall when I, as a child, was reading about like nuclear overkill capacities. And then the Berlin Wall fell. I find it actually pretty interesting that we as a human species are still like nourishing like the thanatos, like you know, the faculty, you know, killing us all. But at the same time, it seems that the knowledge that we in a way would kill almost all of us will be like that pathway and the only one through which we as humanity, as one family, including the other sentient and non-sentient seemingly, you know, entities on this planet, need to move through. Let's hope we both still see that next wall falling. Indy, thanks so much.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you.
Ciao.